in under apartheid. And so economically, South Africa has not changed except for the ANC elites. And so basically, if you were a poor black South African and you've been waiting now 24 years for things to get better, and they're still not better, and your neighbor is a rich white wine producer, would you take a little of his land? At what point does the existing distribution of resources provoke these sorts of seizures? And so we're starting to see this. And this is why, without some actual effort to reduce inequality, South Africa could end up being like Zimbabwe, with random land seizures, with conflicts, and who knows, maybe the same crisis that Zimbabwe experienced. It's really potentially dire in South Africa, which is where the EFF comes in, the Economic Freedom Front, which is basically saying we have to do something differently, right? The ANC is now, so there's a generation that they call the born frees that grew up after apartheid, and so they never experienced it. For that generation, Mandela and the ANC are seen as sellouts, which is interesting because those of us who lived when Mandela was negotiating the end of apartheid have a romanticized attachment to him as this great civil rights leader. But to the current generation of South Africans, they sold out. They sold the country out. And so they talk, here's the phrase they use, they talk about a revolution deferred, meaning, of course, that it will still happen. And this is the thing that happens if you don't address property rights, if you don't have some redistribution, if you continue to marginalize a majority of your population. Unemployment rate under apartheid was 4%. Employment rate now is 27% and has stayed there for the last 2 decades. How sustainable is an unemployment rate of 27% and an inequality in which this small group controls all of the property? And it's the same group that controlled it under apartheid. I have to wonder how long people will continue to talk about that in more detail tomorrow. As to The Economist, I mean, The Economist is an amusing publication. They do some very good things and some really awful things, right? So, I mean, everybody here knows, I'm sure, that they are basically a neoliberal pro-market operation, right? So, but they're not necessarily stupidly so. So, they're a little more thoughtful sometimes, for example, than the World Bank. But their stuff on democracy, I mean, they really do have, I think, a naive belief that democracy and markets solve problems, right? So, and is that historically accurate? Democracy is often better than an oppressive dictatorship, but it's not always, right? Especially if it devolves into Sub-Saharan Africa. Because of ethnic identity, democracy often becomes whichever group is the biggest wins the elections, and they run everything for themselves, and that hurts everybody else, and that makes it conflict almost inevitable. So in those countries, standard Western democracy does not work. And of course, because of the colonial era in which states were divided up, not along ethnic lines, but along colonial lines, there are no natural countries for the most part in Sub-Saharan Africa. They're not grouped by ethnicity. There's no common interest. And so democracy has, well, all right, Western style democracy has not worked very well, except ironically in places like Botswana, where they do have a common interest, and it is one primary group. The importance of unity in making democracy work, sort of a common interest. So, you could imagine some sort of regional independence, which was democratic, but gave each group some control over their own area. But once you sit on top of an African economy that's generating wealth through the colonial paths that the wealth is generated, it's very hard to give up on those. So most governments of Africa do not want to give up on what they would need to give up to have some sort of ethnic independence and regional democracy. Why this sort of national democracy thing in Sub-Saharan African context is a bit of a canard. It's just not realistic. It shows a lack of understanding of the institutional realities of the political situation.
I don't know if anyone of the public would like to make a question to Dr. Snyder. And just to answer your question, I think that we are not very different in this issue about extensive in Mexico. At the level of the state, it's very well known that it's corruption. There's a lot of corruption going on in those lines, and also at the population level, at society, there are a lot of there's a lot of percentage of the population that needs to rely on these cultural ties with the family because they don't have any other option left. So I think we're a little bit better than some sub-Saharan African scenarios, but the basic is the same. It's the same cultural logic. Some questions?
Thank you very much for your lecture. I have two questions. The first one is that we in Latin America, we have a very long tradition on Latin American economic source on economics. So since the I don't know, 4 decades ago or more or less, or more than that, all the developmentalism, new developmentalism uh, streams of thought to discuss development. So in this sense, I would like to ask you if you please could address some words on African economic thought on development, or African writers, African economists, and especially in sub-Saharan economies. And my second question, it would be if you could please say something in more detail about the Zimbabwean crisis, because we are uh, in some sense looking at the Zimbabwean experience in the double monetary pattern and triple monetary pattern, and in this kind of flirtation with formal dollarization with a lot of concern. So if you could address this crisis, thinking about the effects of dollarization, formal dollarization process, and the possible path for development in this trap.
Thank you. Those are wonderfully deep questions. I could go on for another hour, but I'll try and be short. So for the new developmentalism, one of the things that I think you have in Latin America is institutions like this, which have strong independent thought. And so Africa has a much weaker um, university base. So they don't have strong university systems. Most of the people get degrees in the West. So most African economists then, they're sent to Oxford or Cambridge or or somewhere in the US. They get a very Western mainstream approach, and then they go back to Africa. And so there is not the same level of sophistication in terms of the thinking about economic development in a lot of Africa. There are some very good economists and they're friends of mine. But I think it is not as deep. And so the economists that I know that take a broader approach are constantly looking at actually the ideas that are coming out of Latin America, for example. And so in some ways, the new developmentalism is much more consistent with the approach that I was talking about, which is you have to care about institutions. And one of the things I'll talk about tomorrow is the extent to which you have to capture capital domestically, for example, in order to develop economically. It's as opposed to a market-oriented approach, and you have to break those exploitative colonial relationships and so on. And so you see less of that in Africa, though, and I think that's because they have weaker universities, institutions, and because of the prevalence of Western-style education, in which they get their PhDs in the U.S. And I mean, U.S. development economics is all this new institutional stuff. This is what they're taught. And then Zimbabwe. Okay, so the Zimbabwean crisis is a deep one, and it would take a while to cover, but let me cover the most salient aspects of it. In general, the first thing that happened is independence in Zimbabwe happened in 1980. They promised to redistribute a lot of land, but they didn't. And so most of the land ended up, just as in South Africa, in the hands of elites or still in the hands of white farmers. And so after 2 decades of that, a lot of the resistance fighters in Zimbabwe were very upset, and they started land invasions. They basically started taking land for themselves. When they did that, Zimbabwe's major sources of foreign exchange, which were exports of wheat and other commodities, collapsed. So the government lost its export base, which meant that they had no way of getting foreign exchange. So they started paying their bills by printing money. And the economy collapsed so far and so fast, and they printed so much money that at one point their inflation rate was 1,000,000%. Think about that for a second. 1,000,000% inflation. And so what happened then is everybody stopped accepting the Zimbabwean dollar. And so they had to either barter or they had to use dollars or South African rand. So currency became meaningless. And that is actually still the case in Zimbabwe. They have a new currency. Nobody will accept it because of the previous experience. So all of their exchange has to be done in foreign exchange. But then you have no monetary control over your economy. So it's a straitjacket. It's a terrible position to be in. Problem is, they had structural problems that led to this. So when you collapse your major source of export revenues, you have to come up with a new one, or you have to rely on World Bank money, but the World Bank wasn't willing to loan them any money, so they just printed more. I can go into more detail on that if that would be helpful. But yeah, and then I don't know if you saw, but in the recent elections in Zimbabwe, right, the right-hand person who was an oppressive autocrat is the person who took over from the person that they displaced. So the same people are in charge, and they're the ones who stole everything the first time around. So I expect no changes in Zimbabwe in the near future. But it's also an unsustainable situation. In South Africa, there are so many people from Zimbabwe because they can't survive in Zimbabwe because it's so bad. So there are refugees all over the surrounding countries from Zimbabwe. So it's a mess, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. And what we worried about in South Africa is something similar happening, because the same underlying inequalities that were in Zimbabwe are also present in South Africa.
Anyone else?
Schneider. So my first question is there any country, you talk about comparative institutional advantage. So is there any country actually doing this, making policies to have this advantage in which products? And if there's any country doing this, which country has done it better in the last years? Which country has done anything? So yeah.
To me, that's the question that matters the most in economic development. So I think a good way to think about this is there are periods in which countries do this, and then they lapse often depending on the political situation. So in sub-Saharan Africa, people point to Mauritius, for example, as a place in which they developed a location in which foreign investment, it was very friendly towards foreign investment. On the other hand, it sort of basically was a sweatshop-based economy, which didn't leave behind much wealth, so it actually didn't help them very much. So ironically, the government in sub-Saharan Africa that is doing this best is Botswana. So Botswana had a different colonial experience than the rest of sub-Saharan Africa in that they found diamonds after the British left, right? Because we know what would have happened if they found diamonds before that, right? So they had diamond wealth that they could invest. And so they invested in their population. So they have a very generous welfare state, and they've had the longest period of economic growth and development for 40 years of all of sub-Saharan Africa. What's interesting is they were derailed by accident by the changes in South Africa. So they started to do the perfect thing, which was they started to develop manufacturing tied around South Africa's manufacturing. So for example, South Africa has some car manufacturing, and they have the mines, and you can produce things for the mines, and they had some clothing and so on. So Botswana started to produce things for South Africa, and it was working. And then Mandela became president and was convinced by the World Bank to go with free markets, and all the manufacturing died in South Africa. And that meant all Botswana's markets in South Africa died. And so they were doing the right policies. They were just victim of bad luck. So when you think about countries that are doing this well, though, look at China, South Korea, any late industrializing countries. They all set up an environment which captured capital and made people want to invest domestically. And they developed local expertise. So, Trump is very upset with China, right? Because they insist that when an American firm invests there, China insists they have to be a local partner. They have to use the latest technology. They have to invest in the local economy. Those are the perfect things that you want to do, right? So access to your market depends on those conditions. China has an advantage, of course, that nobody else does, which is they have a very, very large market. But that doesn't change the fact that that is the right approach, right? To set conditions that will develop industries in your country based on your own unique characteristics. So, I think if you look at especially South Korea, Taiwan, China, currently Vietnam is doing very interesting things as well. And just to give you an example from Vietnam, in Vietnam, they have a very, it's former communist, maybe still a bit, but they're moving in a direction like China to start markets, but they're doing it in a controlled sort of way. So, for example, they have two cell phone companies, both are state-owned, but they compete with each other. So this is not a market that we would think of as normal, but it is in fact spectacularly successful. Both countries are growing, service is getting better, they're attracting international partners. So this is what I mean about using the institutional structure of their economy, which is a fairly closed socialist/communist country, to attract and retain investment, to use that to facilitate economic growth. So the electronics and cell phone market in Vietnam is much more robust than most other developing countries, where it is taken over by Western countries. So that's an example of how you can cultivate an industry in your own economy that then leads to economic development.
Another question?
Over in Africa.
Take over what?
Take over in Africa. I mean, how American banks are confronting this competition with Chinese banks in Africa, particularly.
Yeah, the Chinese presence in Africa is fascinating. I mean, and it's in banks and it's also in a lot of industries. So the thing with US banks, though, US banks are short-term profit oriented, right? Everything is about quarterly earnings. So the banks in the US don't think long-term. So they don't think that that's particularly profitable. So they don't want a presence in Africa because they are not thinking long-term. So they're happy to let China do that pretty much, which is interesting because in other places which they see as more profitable, especially, for example, Europe, they will do everything in their power to keep out a Chinese presence. So, I mean, but this is the unique aspect of the US financial system, right? US financial system is all about short-term quarterly profits. And if a US bank doesn't see a short-term opportunity, they will ignore any potential benefits, which is what they're pretty much ignoring all of Africa right now because it doesn't have much of an economic presence. Not much money to be made there at the moment. That was certainly not always the case. South Africa was the United States' most profitable source of investment during apartheid. We were very happy to invest in South Africa during the apartheid regime. But now it's not so profitable, so we don't.
Anyone else?
Yeah. I'm wondering if there is any measure for improving the position of women in rural areas in South Africa.
Yeah, the gender issue in South Africa is a difficult one. So South Africa has a lot of gender violence and a lot of gender inequality. The weird thing in South Africa is they have one of the most progressive constitutions in the world in terms of women's rights, and the ANC has mandated that at least 40% of women that run for office should be women, and so on. So they have paid lip service to it. At the same point, it is not a very good situation for women, and that is changing very slowly. So, the thing is, apartheid was a hyper-masculine culture, and it cultivated gender relations that really were, I think, a throwback. So I think it not only suspended, but reversed progress along gender lines. And so when you think about South Africa having apartheid in place until 1994 and only just starting to deal with the gender issues then, you start to realize how long it's going to take. Culture and cultural phenomena like gender roles take a long time to change, I think, as we've seen everywhere. And South Africa is working on it, but the deep cultural patriarchal institutions are very, very difficult. What I will say is one of the things I do in Cape Town when I work with a lot of community groups, and the most dynamic ones are headed by women. So if there were just a little bit more money in South Africa going to community groups in the poor townships, we would start to see dramatic changes. So they're starting businesses, they're forming community groups, they're doing incredible work. They just have no resources. And the problem is the male-headed ANC is in charge of the resources, and they aren't very good at redistributing them. So, a non-corrupt government that actually paid attention to these issues and then actually funded women's groups and the amazing work they're doing could achieve a tremendous amount. But that's not happening much. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that the thing that is distinctive about apartheid is it lasted longer until more recently, and it was more exploitative. And I think that uh, at least more later, it was so the exploitative and because institutions take a long time to change, it is still very exploitative. So they dispossessed Africans of their land because they needed cheap labor for the gold and diamond mines, for example, which they did all over Africa. They take the best land, they displace people from their land, then they have workers and so on. So that story is an ancient one. But of course, that continued in South Africa until 1994, and then it still continues. So the weird thing to me in South Africa is the mining system, which still uses migrant labor from the entire Southern African region, is still in place. So they could have created settled labor and they could have paid the workers better and created different institutions, but they haven't. So it's stunning to me the extent to which the colonial patterns are still in place to a greater degree than the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, but only to a greater degree because by and large they're still the same. Now, as to China's role in that, I mean, China is after resources, and they will get those resources any way they can. And if they can spend a little money on infrastructure or give money to a bank in order to get access to resources, then they will. So South Africa is sitting on $2.3 trillion of mineral wealth, largest amount in the world. So China wants access to that. It includes rare earth metals and all sorts of things that they want to have. So China is investing money, and they're giving some of it away to South Africa in order to gain advantages. But it's not, you're right, it's not going to lead to development because that's not what China is interested in. They're interested in the resources. So I think in general, if you don't have an independent development that is targeting your domestic economy and that keeps the money local, it's not going to help. It doesn't matter if it goes to China, right? I mean, if only a few corrupt government officials in China is getting the benefits of that resource development, that doesn't lead to anything substantial in terms of economic development. I think there are a few cases in which a domestic government is stronger in Africa, in which the Chinese investment has been more positive. So a lot of this is dependent on how good the government is and how willing they are to insist on conditions.
Another question?
So there have been a lot of studies of that topic. It's incredibly voluminous, and the studies. So statistically, the studies come down on both sides. There are some studies that show that democracy fosters economic growth, and some studies that show a negative correlation. So I think the statistical evidence is not clear. I think partly the statistical evidence is not clear because the experience with democracy is so different. Is a one-party state a democracy? So how are you going to measure democracy? And the problem I have with most studies is they are done by organizations that have an ideological axe to grind. So the Freedom House, for example, the Freedom House is a very neoliberal group, and so for example, they would define Cuba as hopelessly repressive. But I think that's open to interpretation. And I know an economist who works closely with the Cuban government who thinks that, in fact, here's the weird thing in Cuba. You don't have political power, but in your workplace, you have a lot of say in what happens. So is that more democratic or less? I mean, according to Freedom House, it is, because that's what they want it to be. Because they're ideological and they're pro-Western and they have a very narrow definition of it. So I have a very difficult time separating out the idea of democracy from how it actually functions in specific places on the ground. I think it's very hard to in broad terms, say democracy is good for development. I think there are absolutely places where that's true. For example, I think Ethiopia has been so corrupt that if they finally have democratic elections, and maybe my friend Berhanu will be elected president, then I think things will get better. I mean, I really do, actually. But just having democratic election in a country that has been oppressive for decades would be positive. But in much of the rest of Africa, the elections are meaningless. Museveni has been in power in Uganda for so long, and they have elections, but they're not real elections. So I don't even know what to say about their economic growth performance, which has been good. But is it because of democracy? It's not a real democracy. So how do we evaluate that question? Even I think there's no easy way, and this is there's this belief in development that there should be easy answers. And I don't believe that. I think in general that if you don't understand the conditions on the ground in a particular place, like the political dynamics in a particular place, you can't tell if democracy is going to be useful or not. Yeah, same formula. Yes. And it's very clear it's been a disaster for most developing countries. It amuses me the extent to which the World Bank tries to spin South Korea, for example, as an example of neoliberal policy being successful. And if you look back, that is not what they did. So No, I think you're absolutely right about that. That one size fits all methodology really flies in the face of development, which is really about constructing institutions that will support industrialization in your own country. I do think we need to be more creative about this. You know, for example, India has skipped some steps on development. So they haven't gone through the traditional route of simple manufacturing and then higher end manufacturing. They moved straight into, for example, services and skills. I think other countries could do that. South Africa has a very, very good English language skills. So the call centers that right now are going to India could go to South Africa, for example. That's not a normal industrialization path, but it fits their institutions because they have good English language skills. Yes, that's correct. Yes, that's right. It's very difficult in fractured countries. How do you unite behind a vision of development? So the countries that have succeeded, so China succeeds in part because they have a vision for development and the state is so monolithic, they control it. So you can't disagree with them. And there were some disasters as a result of that, but it also fostered economic development. So I do think that history shows national identity is crucial. Is that necessarily the case? I mean, why can't a fractured country do it? You probably need to think about regional development. I think the Swiss model is very good. So, in terms of fractured countries, so Switzerland has all these cantons. I don't know if anybody knows the Swiss system of government. They have independent cantons. They have a national government and national policies about tariffs and currency and things like that. But each canton is relatively independent and they can set their own policy. And what they have done, for example, is they have the world's best train system. So every tiny town in the Alps, in the middle of nowhere, has incredibly fast trains and incredibly fast internet. So the government built it. And then what does the municipality do? If they want to, they can set something up. So I don't know if you know this or not, but Switzerland does the fine manufacturing for Germany. So German is always thought of as the fine manufacturing. No, they go to Switzerland for the finest. But how did Switzerland construct that? They created this incredible infrastructure and a very skilled workforce and things like that. They constructed the institutions that would make them successful in those industries. So, and they did that separately in separate regions because they have different languages and different cultures. And so each region did it relatively independently. Yeah, right. But they were also willing to, most central governments will not relinquish control. And they try and control the entire economy, and that's where the problems then come in. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot, Geoffrey, for this talk, and I hopefully see you tomorrow to be continued. And we kindly invite you to join us to the next conference of Dr. Snyder here at this faculty at 11 o'clock, but in Sala Fernando Benítez. So thanks a lot, Geoffrey.